The word landed at the center of my wedding reception, like a stone thrown into glass. It's Admiral. One word, 6 syllables if you count the rank before my name. Spoken clearly, without hesitation, by a man who had just stepped through the double doors at the far end of the room and was now moving through the parted crowd toward me like he owned the weather. I remember the forks freezing midair. I remember the way conversation didn't just stop, it collapsed. I remember the sound of chair legs dragging across hardwood as 100 heads turned in unison, trying to understand what was happening, who was being addressed, and why the air in the room had suddenly changed pressure. He was tall, silver-haired, straight-spined, and moving with the kind of authority that doesn't require a uniform to be visible. And when he stopped in front of me and raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute, I looked past him, just for a moment, and found the face of the man who had been publicly humiliating me for the past 20 minutes. My new father-in-law, Harold. His glass was still raised, mid-toast, his mouth still slightly open, and every drop of color had left his face as if someone had pulled a drain somewhere behind his eyes. That moment, the one where everything changed, didn't begin at the reception. It didn't begin with the toast, or the insult, or even the whispers that had been building all week. It began, as most important things do, much quieter than that, with a choice I made decades ago to stop leading with my credentials and start simply living my life. I retired from the United States Navy at 58 years old and moved to a small coastal town in Virginia, about 20 minutes from Norfolk. Nobody there knew me as Rear Admiral Evelyn Carter. They knew me as Evelyn, the woman who grew tomatoes in the summer, kept her hedges tidy in the fall, and had a small American flag by her front door not as decoration, but as something she had earned the right to display. That was exactly how I wanted it. I had spent 32 years being Admiral Carter in rooms where every word I spoke carried operational weight, where my posture was read before my orders, where people either straightened instinctively in my presence or worked hard to pretend they didn't. After 3 decades of that, the greatest luxury I could imagine was buying groceries without anyone standing straighter. So I simply didn't tell people. Not out of shame, not out of secrecy, just out of a profound and hard-earned desire to be known as a person before I was known as a rank. I met Richard at a community fundraiser on a warm Thursday in October. It was exactly the kind of event where the ambitions are small and the kindness is real, a neighborhood fundraiser for the local library, folding tables covered in tablecloths, someone's grandmother manning the lemonade station. I had brought lemon bars. Richard had brought a box of store-bought cookies and apologized for them before anyone had taken a single bite. That detail lodged itself in my chest immediately. He was a widower, 5 years out, with the slightly careful look of a man who had rebuilt himself slowly and wasn't entirely sure the construction was finished. He talked about books. He talked about the way the tide looked different in winter. He didn't ask what I'd done for a living, which was either courtesy or wisdom, and at our age, the two are often the same thing. We talked for nearly 2 hours that first night. He never pressed me about my past. Not over the next several months, not when we started seeing each other regularly, not even when the conversations grew deeper and more serious. He knew I had worked in government. He seemed to accept that some doors stay closed not because there's something shameful behind them, but because the person inside has earned the right to decide when they swing open. I loved him for that. His family, however, was a different story. Harold Dempsey had built his life in federal contracting, and he wore his success the way some men wear their best suit, even when it wasn't appropriate for the occasion. The first time I met him, he shook my hand with the firm grip of a man performing confidence, looked me up and down with an expression that was less curiosity and more assessment, and said, "Richard tells me you've had a quiet career." I smiled. I suppose that's one way to put it. He nodded slowly, something moved behind his eyes, calculation maybe, or doubt. Over the following months, as Richard and I grew closer, and the families began to orbit each other more frequently, Harold's tone sharpened quietly, the way a knife sharpens, incrementally and without announcement. I imagine retirement is easier when expectations weren't set too high to begin with. You've done well for yourself, considering Richard has always had a generous heart. None of it was loud enough to call out without seeming thin-skinned. None of it was direct enough to confront. In a room full of people who were still deciding how much they liked me, It was the particular cruelty of a practiced man, the kind who never raises his voice because he's learned he doesn't have to. I let it pass. At 63, you understand which battles are worth the energy and which ones will reveal themselves in their own time, without any help from you. Richard proposed on my porch in early March, watching the sun go flat against the water. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and said, "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left without you standing next to me." No speech, no performance, just honesty. I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Wedding planning brought the families together more often, and Harold's questions became less subtle. What exactly did you do in government? Was it administrative? Policy? Your pension, is it adequate? I answered calmly, I worked in operations. It was a long career, I'm comfortable. He wanted specifics. He wanted something he could weigh on whatever internal scale he used to sort people into their appropriate categories. I was giving him nothing to weigh, and that bothered him more than any answer I could have provided. At a planning lunch 3 weeks before the wedding, Harold leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who believes the room belongs to him and said, "You know, Evelyn, marriage isn't just about companionship. There's standing involved, reputation." "I agree," I said. He nodded, satisfied. Then, "I just want to be sure my son isn't settling." The table went still. Richard started to speak. I placed my hand gently over his. "It's all right," I said. And I meant it, not because the words didn't sting, they did, but because I had learned something in 32 years of command that no management seminar ever teaches. People who need to diminish you are always telling you something about themselves. I just needed to wait and let him finish the sentence. I knew something was building the week before the wedding. I could feel it the way you feel a weather change before the sky shows it, in the pressure, in the pauses, in the particular edge Harold brought to every interaction. 3 days before the ceremony, at a family dinner at his and Diane's house, he had asked me in front of everyone what my title had been. When I said I'd worked in operations, he gave a small, practiced laugh and said, "Some jobs are harder to explain than others." Diane reached for the bread basket. That was the moment I understood what Saturday would look like. Harold wasn't going to let the day pass without making his point. He had been circling something for months, some public declaration that would establish, once and for all, the hierarchy as he understood it. He just needed the right audience. A room full of family and friends would do nicely. The wedding itself was exactly what I had wanted. A small Episcopal church near the waterfront. Morning light coming in warm through clear windows. 58 people who had been invited because they mattered, not to fill seats. Richard standing at the front looking handsome and overwhelmed in his charcoal suit, his hands clasped slightly too tight until he saw me step into the aisle, and then, slowly, everything about him softened. That expression alone would have been enough to carry me through whatever came next. Our vows were simple. His voice broke slightly on the word cherish. Mine stayed steady, though I felt far more than I showed, a skill I had spent a career perfecting and would have gladly traded in that moment for the ability to cry at will like a normal woman. When the minister pronounced us married, the church rose. For a few minutes, standing in that warm applause, I let myself believe it might simply stay that way. That Harold had made his peace with things. That the afternoon would be uncomplicated and beautiful, and exactly what a wedding at our age should be. The reception was held at the local yacht club, old wood floors, white tablecloths, framed regatta photographs, the gentle sound of a trio playing standards near the window. It was exactly the kind of room where people lean in when they speak and don't check their phones. For the first hour, everything was warm and easy. People told stories. They brought gifts. They pulled Richard aside and held his hand too long in the way people do when they're relieved that someone they love has found happiness again. I should have known Harold had been waiting. He rose for his toast mid-afternoon, after the food had been served and the wine had done its quiet work on the room. He straightened his jacket, lifted his glass, and waited for the crowd to settle with the patience of a man who has calculated exactly how much he can get away with. "This is certainly a memorable day," he began. Light laughter, people leaning back comfortable. "I've watched my son walk through some hard years." A pause pitched Jew. "Sent right, losing a wife changes a man. It leaves him vulnerable in ways he may not even recognize himself." Richard shifted in the seat beside me. Harold's eyes moved across the room, collecting attention. So when someone new appears later in life with limited history, naturally a father has questions. The laughter faded. I'll be honest, he looked at me now. Evelyn has always been something of a mystery to this family, very private, which in itself isn't unusual. He let the pause do its work. But when a person enters a family and withholds so much, it's natural for people to wonder what exactly is being withheld. I heard Marianne, Richard's sister, pull in a sharp breath beside me. Harold's voice grew a degree more confident with the silence feeding it. My son is a decent man, a trusting man, and I'll say what perhaps others have been too polite to voice. When someone appears with vague references to government work and a very comfortable life, a family has the right to ask whether the interest is love. He paused, or security. The room didn't gasp, it did something worse. It went completely, entirely, utterly still. Somewhere near the back, a glass was set down too carefully. Richard stood, that's enough. Harold, emboldened now, pressed forward. I'm protecting my son. If that's uncomfortable, I apologize. His eyes found mine again, and I watched him pull the trigger on the thing he'd been loading for months. For all we know, she spent her career in some office somewhere, learned just enough government vocabulary to sound important, and none of us were ever given the information to know otherwise. The silence that followed was not an empty silence. It was full, crammed with the discomfort of 100 people who had just watched something go too far and didn't know where to put their eyes. Richard turned to me horrified. Evelyn. I touched his arm, it's all right. And then I stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way you stand when you have absolutely nothing to prove, and the other person is the only one in the room who doesn't know it yet. Every eye followed me. Harold's chin lifted slightly, reading my composure as hesitation. You're entitled to your opinions, Harold, I said, my voice even and clear. But you are not entitled to invent my biography simply because I declined to perform it for your approval. A few people near the front nodded, almost involuntarily. Harold gave a thin smile. Then perhaps you'd like to enlighten us. I held his gaze. No, I said, I don't think I need to. That was when the doors at the back of the room opened. At first, no one paid attention. Late arrivals happen. But then the energy in the room changed, that subtle, impossible to describe shift that happens when authority enters a space. Not noise, not announcement, just presence, the kind that moves through a crowd the way a current moves through water. A man in a dark suit stepped through the door. Silver-haired, straight-backed, with the unhurried walk of someone who has never needed to rush a room to command it. Two others followed at a respectful distance. He didn't look at the crowd. He wasn't looking for the bar or the coat rack or an empty seat. He was looking for me. I recognized him before he'd covered half the distance between us. Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker. We had served together for nearly a decade in two different commands, overlapping in places I still wasn't authorized to discuss in certain company. He had aged, the hair fully silver now, the lines deeper, but his posture was exactly what it had always been. The kind that doesn't negotiate. He walked through the parted crowd without touching anyone, and when he reached me, he stopped, squared his shoulders, raised his hand, and gave me a full, formal, unmistakable military salute. Good morning, Admiral. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. For a moment, I didn't move. Not from shock, I had understood what this moment was the second he walked through the door. I paused because I wanted the room to hear it, to absorb it, to understand exactly what had just been said and what it meant. Then I returned the salute, quietly. Good morning, Tom. The ripple moved through the room like something physical. Chairs shifting, breath catching, the soft clatter of silverware set down mid-sentence. I turned and looked at Harold. He had gone completely white. Not embarrassed white, not caught off guard white. The specific, deep, draining white of a man watching his entire framework for understanding a person collapse in real time. His glass was still in his hand. His mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. I had seen that expression before, usually on the other side of a very different kind of table. Whitaker lowered his hand and turned to the room. I apologize for arriving unannounced. I was informed of the occasion late and felt it appropriate to attend. His gaze settled briefly on Harold, just briefly. I see I've arrived at an interesting moment. Harold swallowed. Admiral, I didn't realize. No, Whitaker said. The single word landed without inflection or contempt, which somehow made it heavier than both. You didn't. Richard was beside me now, completely still. Evelyn, he said quietly. I turned to him. There was no anger in his face, no accusation. There was confusion, yes, and something that looked very much like awe. I reached for his hand. I was going to tell you, I said softly. I know, he replied. And he did, I could see it. Whitaker stepped slightly to the side, giving me the room, staying present. One of the older guests near the front leaned toward his wife and whispered, not quite quietly enough, "Did he say Admiral?" The answer was visible in the posture of everyone who had heard it. People were sitting differently now, listening with different ears. And Harold was not moving. He took a half step toward me, then stopped, as if he'd suddenly become uncertain about his own access to the space I occupied. Evelyn, he said, his voice was different now, the polish was gone. I had no idea. I know, I said. If I had known. That's the point, I said gently. If you had known, you would have treated me differently, and that is precisely why I didn't tell you. The room absorbed that in silence. Whitaker cleared his throat softly and addressed the gathering with the same calibrated precision he'd once used to brief joint commands. Admiral Carter served with distinction for over 3 decades. She commanded operations that most people in this country will never know about and made decisions that protected lives in ways she was never permitted to receive credit for. He paused. Those facts should have been irrelevant to the conversation that apparently preceded my arrival. Another pause. But since they were raised, I felt they deserved the appropriate context. Harold flinched. It was small but visible. I glanced at Whitaker. Tom, I said quietly. He inclined his head, understood, and said nothing more. What happened next was not a triumph. I want to be careful about that, because it would be easy to frame what followed as a victory, the moment justice swept in wearing a dark suit and put the bully in his place. But that's not what it was. What it was something more complicated and ultimately more valuable. It was a room full of people seeing something clearly for the first time and not quite knowing what to do with the view. I looked around at the faces I had come to know over the past year. Diane, Richard's mother, sitting with her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes full. Marianne, somewhere between disbelief and relief. Richard, still holding my hand, looking at me with the expression of a man who realizes he's been standing next to a depth he hadn't yet taken the measure of. And Harold, who had spent our entire acquaintance trying to sort me into a category that would tell him how to feel about me, now standing in the middle of his son's wedding reception with nowhere left to hide. I straightened slightly and spoke, not to Harold specifically, but to the room, because the room had earned the right to hear it. I didn't keep my history private to deceive anyone. My voice was steady, conversational. I kept it private because I wanted to live the remainder of my life as a person, not as a rank. No one interrupted. I have spent years in rooms where titles were essential, where authority had to be established immediately, where someone's reaction to your position could determine the outcome of a situation before a single word was spoken. I paused, but this was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be family. The word landed the way I intended it to. Harold's eyes dropped. When he raised them again, something in them had shifted, not broken, opened. I was wrong, he said. It came out quietly, without decoration, without the careful framing of a man managing his reputation. Just 3 words, spoken plainly by someone who had finally run out of positions to defend. Diane moved first. She crossed the room and took my hand in both of hers, her eyes red at the edges. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. I should have said something weeks ago. I should have. You're saying it now, I told her. Marianne was close behind. I saw what was happening, she said, and I didn't stop it. I don't have a better reason than that I was afraid of the argument. She looked at me honestly. That's not good enough. No, I agreed, but the fact that you're saying it is. Whitaker caught my eye from across the room, gave me a single nod, and moved toward the exit. I excused myself briefly and reached him near the door. You didn't have to come, I said. He gave me the faint, dry look I remembered from 100 briefings. I was in the area. Tom, A corner of his mouth moved. I received a call this morning. Someone from town said there might be a situation. He adjudes. Ted his cuff. I thought it would be appropriate to make an appearance. Just an appearance, I said. Entirely incidental, he agreed. Then, quieter. You deserved better than what was being said about you in there, Evelyn. I couldn't correct 30 years of service, but I could correct the last 20 minutes. He shook my hand, nodded once more, and left. It took Richard and me a long time to get to our first dance. By the time the band began playing again, soft and careful, as if testing the air, the room had found its way back to something warmer, though changed. The tension had gone. What replaced it wasn't relief exactly. More like the feeling after a long conversation that finally got to the truth. When we finally took the floor, Richard held me closer than I expected. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly after a minute. I looked up at him, because I needed to know you were choosing me, not my history. He was quiet for a moment. I would have. I know, I said, but I needed to find that out naturally, not after you'd been told. That's, he started. Complicated, I offered. I was going to say frustrating, he paused, but I understand it. We moved slowly through the rest of the song. Near the end, he said softly, I want to know everything, in your own time, however much you want to tell me. I rested my head against his shoulder. Then we'd better get comfortable, I said, because it's a long story. He laughed softly into my hair. Later in the evening, after the plates had been cleared and the guests had thinned to a warm inner circle, I slipped out to the club's rear terrace. The night had come in full. The marina below was dark and rocking, masts tapping quietly against the quiet. The sky was the kind of deep blue that looks like it's been poured. I heard the door open behind me and knew, from the particular quality of the footstep, who it was. Harold crossed the terrace and stopped a few feet away, not at the railing, not at the door, somewhere in the middle, like a man who wasn't sure where he belonged in the space. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I've spent most of my adult life believing I could read people. I waited. I was good at it, in business at least. I could size up a room in 3 minutes, know who had leverage, who was performing, who to trust. He looked out at the water. Today I found out there's a significant difference between reading a person and sorting one. That was more honest than I'd expected. He turned to face me. You made me feel irrelevant. He said it without accusation, just observation. Not deliberately, I can see that now. But Richard listens to you in a way he stopped listening to me years ago, not from disrespect, from trust. And the less you explained yourself, the more locked out I felt. His voice dropped a register. I told myself I was protecting him, but mostly I didn't like not being the authority in the room. I considered him in the dark. That's a remarkably clear-eyed thing to say. I've had about 45 minutes to think, he said dryly. Almost a smile, not quite. Why didn't you take me apart when you had the chance? He asked. After the salute, you had the whole room. I was standing there with nothing left. I turned slightly to face him. Because humiliation isn't correction. It would have felt good for about 5 minutes, and then I would have spent my marriage managing the damage. He absorbed that. The point isn't that you were wrong about my rank, I continued. The point is that you believed my rank was what entitled me to respect. That's the thing that needed addressing, not your pride. He was quiet for a long moment. My father was the same kind of man, he said finally. Harder maybe. In his house, you didn't question authority. You didn't withhold information. You absolutely never let him feel small. He paused. I spent 40 years thinking I'd moved past that. And then today I found out I just learned to do it more politely. That was perhaps the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. That's usually how it works, I told him. He exhaled, a long, slow sound, like something releasing. Then he straightened and looked at me directly for the first time all evening without any agenda behind his eyes. I'd like to start over, he said, not because of who you are, because of what you showed me today. You can start, I said, by speaking honestly to your son tomorrow, not as his father delivering a verdict, as a man admitting he was wrong. I can do that. And to Diane, she's been smoothing your sharp edges for a long time. She deserves to know you see it. He nodded, and this time it looked like resolve rather than performance. For whatever it's worth, he said quietly, I am glad Richard married you. I held his gaze. That's the first genuinely respectful thing you've said to me. He accepted that without protest. Then he turned and walked back inside, and I stood there in the arc for a long moment, listening to the water and the muffled warmth of the reception beyond the glass. Richard found me a few minutes later. "You've been out here a while," he said. Thinking." He stood beside me at the railing. Harold came back inside looking like a different man. "He might be," I said. "It's too early to know." Richard was quiet for a moment. "What did you say to him?" I looked out at the marina. I told him the truth. "Which is?" "That respect that requires a reason isn't really respect." I paused, "and that it's never too late to become the kind of person who offers it first." Richard stood there with that for a while. Then, "I think your father-in-law might be ready to grow up." I glanced at him. He was already smiling. And I laughed, really laughed, for the first time since morning. The kind of laugh that means something has genuinely released. He put his arm around me. "Tell me something about your life," he said quietly. "Which part?" "Any part, whatever you want to start with." I looked out at the dark water, the lights of the marina shimmering just below the surface, a gull calling somewhere invisible. "All right," I said. And I began. We stayed on that terrace for nearly an hour, him listening, me talking, filling in spaces I had kept empty for years. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to begin. By the time we walked back inside, the last of the guests were gathering their coats and saying their final goodbyes. The band had finished. The candles were burning low. The tables looked like every wedding reception looks at the end of a long, full-day happy wreckage, beautiful and spent. Richard and I stood at the door and thanked each person as they left. "Quite a story you gave us today," one of the older guests said with a knowing smile. "I wasn't aiming for it," I replied. He squeezed my hand. "The best ones never are." We drove home along the coast road with the windows cracked and the radio low. Richard didn't say much on the way. Neither did I. We had done enough talking for one day, and silence between people who trust each other is its own kind of language. When we got home, I changed out of my wedding dress and made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table with our hands wrapped around warm mugs and the windows dark against the night. "Well," Richard finally said, looking at me across the table with a small, disbelieving smile, "that was not the day I planned." "No," I agreed. "But," he said. "But," I echoed. He shook his head slowly. "I think it might have been exactly the day we needed." I thought about that, about Harold standing pale and quiet by his chair, about Diane pressing my hand, about Marianne saying I wish I had spoken up, about Whittaker walking in through those back doors at precisely the moment the room needed something it couldn't manufacture, about the way truth, held patiently and long enough, eventually finds its own timing. "Yes," I said. I looked down at the ring on my hand, simple, gold, honest. "I think you might be right." Later, after Richard had fallen asleep, I stepped out onto the back porch one final time. The water was still. The sky had cleared to that deep, specific dark you only get far enough from the city. Somewhere across the marsh, something moved in the reeds. I stood at the railing and thought about everything the day had contained. The insult, the silence, the salute, the apology, the shift. And I thought about what I had believed since long before any of it. Since my first deployment, my first command, my first real moment of understanding what authority actually was and wasn't. Rank is a tool, character is the hand that holds it. Harold had not needed to know what my rank was to treat me with dignity. He had needed to be the kind of man who treated people with dignity before he knew their rank. That was the whole lesson. That was everything. I turned and looked back through the window at my house. My home, Richard asleep inside it. A new life beginning in all the ordinary, fragile, irreplaceable ways that new lives begin. I thought about what I would say if someone asked me what I'd learned from the day. I would say this: treat people well before you know their story, not after. Because by the time the full picture arrives, by the time the doors open, and the moment comes that shows you who someone really is, it may already be too late to show them who you are. The wind came off the water, soft, familiar, honest. I went inside.